How do we improve public's perception of having a different brain?
I think it's podcasts like this. I think it's us. Yeah, no, I do. And I think it's talking about it. I think it's about training at work, which should hopefully then filter down. I just think people need to talk about it because I think the world is not set up for neurodivergent people, which is obviously if you're autistic, ADHD, dyslexic, dyspraxic, etc. The neurotypical, which is obviously if you don't have a neurodivergent brain, is set up for neurotypicals. But it's almost like one day someone decided that was the norm. That was how we should behave. I did a project and a bit of work with Regent Street a while ago, and they were like, right, how can we make our literally Regent Street more neurodivergent friendly, more sort of accessible? And I'm like, this is amazing. This is really cool that you're even having these conversations. But then what was really interesting was
horrific street. Like it's a
Love
from
it.
an
It's
architectural
stunning,
just stunning and iconic and wonderful.
Neurodivergent.
Oh my God, it's like
families.
It's making me.
It's a bit, you are,
making me squirm thinking about it.
Because there's a lot going on.
Yes.
So we were just talking about loads of different things, but I love that that's even a conversation that even Regent Street are literally saying, what can we do to improve things?
Heathrow,
oh my
Gatwick,
gosh, yeah,
if you're listening.
Yeah, there's like, and there's a lot of people doing a lot of things, and I think there's just still so much work to be done. So that's kind of what we're trying to do. The Perfectly Autistic, like you said, working with big corporate companies, partners with Minds Mental Health at Work, which is amazing. And just the more people that we can train and discuss, and, you know, we then run workshops and training sessions, and everything we do is completely bespoke. So it's completely bespoke for that industry and that company, because everyone is different.
There are some pretty crazy stats about sort of unemployment rates and neurodivergence. Why do you think that is? I
think it's really difficult. Like we discussed at the beginning that, like, you know, I've had 30 different full-time jobs. So, you know, I think it's about people who are neurodivergent either finding the interview process really difficult because it's not very neurodivergent friendly. Think about, as a society, the amount of pressure we put on eye contact. Firm handshake. Oh, that's not a very firm handshake. You know, they're not going to be very good at the job, which is ridiculous, isn't it? You know, or maybe they talk too much, or they fidgeted, and they obviously
there's all these norms.
Norms, aren't there? You know, these societal things that we look and think, oh, that is what makes a good, you know, employee. And Kelly used to work as a recruitment consultant, a headhunter many years ago, and he said, you know, that sort of straight away they'd be like, well, you know, they're going to be any good, and the receptionists were like, well, they were a bit brusque with me. Oh, okay, well, they're not going to be any good for the job, you know. So it's a bit crazy, really. But I think there's a stat around only 16% of autistic people are in full-time employment, which is just crazy. But I think it's just so sad. But the trouble is, if workplaces aren't going to put the effort in to be neurodivergent friendly, to have quiet spaces, to have breakout rooms, to make sure that neurodivergent people are being accommodated without the employer thinking, well, why am I doing this? This is, you know, why should I do this? Actually, there's so much that comes from hiring neurodivergent people: diversity of thought, creativity, innovation, all that kind of thing. And I think there's such a loss of amazing talent, and there's so many people out there. You know, that's where you get loads of business owners, don't you? Either intentionally or unintentionally, that set up their own businesses. But I think there's so much work that needs to be done, and we do a lot of training for that with companies, and do workshops, and we work with recruitment and HR teams, because the whole interview process just needs to change. You know, there's nothing wrong with giving questions beforehand, as long as you do it to everybody, like we said before.
If an employee came to me and said, hey, look, I'm struggling with this, or I just think I might be this, or I need to take some time off to do this, and it was centered around neurodivergence, given I am now diagnosed, I'd be like, oh my God, how can I help? Yeah. Definitely. Where do you think, you know, bigger companies where it's harder to do that, where do you think they're at with that access and help for their employees?
I think it depends on the company. I think some companies are much more open to it than others. And then I think there are some companies that think they're open to it, and then when it happens, don't actually know what to do. So I think that's why the training and talking is so important. And I think also as well, having people internally in companies, if anyone's listening to this now who is fairly senior in a role, talk about being neurodivergent, be open, because it's got to start from the top down. It can't just be like a bolt-on. It's got to be sort of embedded in the culture that, look, we're really open. We talk about this. And like you mentioned, you know, people talk about mental health at work, etc. And that's, you know, openly discussed now. Still think there's a stigma, I have to say, but it's seen as being more openly discussed. And it should be the same with neurodivergence. And I think the trouble is if you've got people at work who don't know they're autistic or ADHD and they're diagnosed or not diagnosed later in life, that can then cause huge anxieties, that can lead to depression, etc., because you're wondering why you're struggling with work or that, you're not fitting in as well, or, out of, after work drinks and you don't really want to do it because that coin analogy we've used, your coins were gone by 2 p.m. because you'd had loads of meetings and some difficult conversations or whatever. You then don't want to have to go out after work and socialise. But then if you don't do that, you're saying, well, are you serious about your job? Are you wanting to be part of this team and this company, etc.? So I think there's a real bit of a crossroads at the moment, I think, where companies are needing to be more open and supporting. And definitely a lot of companies, I think, that come to us are doing that because otherwise they wouldn't be coming to us.
Yep.
But then some come to us and say, look, we've got loads to learn. What can you teach us? We don't know what we don't know. So quite often we're like, here's a pick and mix. This is what we can offer. This is what we can do. But, talk to your people, see what they want because they know what's going on internally. But I think the depression and anxiety linked to, like you said, people being at work, etc., is just huge because especially women in ADHD, so many women have been misdiagnosed. Thankfully, I wasn't. I feel really grateful for that. But a lot of people were misdiagnosed with anxiety, with, BPD, borderline personality disorder. And I know, bipolar, etc. And I know some women have got these conditions, inverted commas, on their medical records. And they're like, I'm not. It turns out I've got ADHD or I was autistic. And almost like they've got this on their medical records and they're trying to get that removed because they're like, I was misdiagnosed. And that's a huge thing. And that then impacts you. But also then looking back, there's a lot of people Kelly often says he looks back with sadness because he's like, well, what if I'd have chosen a different route? Because he said he always wouldn't have necessarily chosen this corporate route in sales, head of sales and head of marketing and, being a headhunter years ago and a trainer and all that kind of stuff. He was just like, I'd have gone a different path. So I think there's a lot of people that look back with their diagnosis with sadness because you go, God, but when I coach my clients with ADHD coaching, etc., it's about looking forward, which is how I am as a person naturally, because you can look back and grieve and think, gosh, and for a lot of people, they've missed out on lots of different things because of not knowing that they were neurodivergent, which is really sad. But then it's about looking forward, literally looking forwards and looking forward, so that they can then go, right, I know who I am now. I'm only in my 30s or 40s. Here we go kind of thing. Yeah,
I think the sort of certainly this late diagnosis, looking back, reflections, I've probably had more personally, yeah. I get it. That's why. Yeah. Than maybe lots of sadness or regret. And I don't know whether that's just the way my brain works of like, let's move on.
Yes.
Let's keep going. We move on.
That's also partly ADHD, isn't it? That not quite tick done, but you don't almost sometimes, especially as well, when you've achieved amazing things, you don't always sit there and go, oh my God, look what we've just done. So you do need to try and just be in the moment and be present. But I think for a lot of women, especially with this misdiagnosis, it is absolutely huge and causing a real problem. And I know that, there's a huge problem with mental health and children being undiagnosed. And you talked about the waiting lists for adults and waiting lists for children is massive as well. And if they're not diagnosed, they can often go through life being told they're stupid or lazy or, stop fidgeting or stop talking so much. And that has a huge impact as well, which is really sad because there's going to be a whole generation of children with really poor mental health because of undiagnosed conditions.
Yeah, and the school system, I've got 3 girls and the school system, I know it's not a kind of just broad brush stroke of like it's just not up to scratch, but I think and I could see this sort of happening in the workplace of like, oh, if you're autistic, here's a really good company to work for.
Yeah.
And if you're ADHD, here's another really good company. And this company is really good for dyslexic people.
And this is the thing, isn't it? I think I could go on for days about schools and I won't. We actually home educate our children. So that's a whole nother conversation because it just didn't work for us and we tried. And there's not a lot of places available for children who are really bright, who are where they should be academically or ahead academically, but can't cope with the sensory element of the classroom, of the school, of assemblies, of that kind
uniform,
of
et cetera,
uniform. Dear God, the itchiness of the, all that kind of stuff. So, but like you said, it's almost then about not pigeonholing people, but there just isn't enough specialist placements, you sort of hear of people in EHCPs for children, which is educational healthcare plans to get the support. And this is why there's so much of a problem with the delay in diagnosis, because without this inverted commas label, people often say, why do you want to label them? Either yourself or your children. But without a label, you cannot get the support. But then these children grow up and then go to work. And this is what we always say selfishly at Perfectly Autistic. We kind of want to make the world a better place so that when India and Hudson go out and get a job, the world's a bit more like, yeah, okay, you can tick that box to say you're autistic or ADHD, and people aren't going to go, oh, okay, what does that mean? How does that look? What do we do with this? I'm not quite sure. So we always sort of say that, both India and Hudson are going to go out and do great things. We're trying to just, selfishly talk about it as much as we can, educate people as much as we can, and have these conversations. So it's like now they've changed like Autism Awareness Month to Autism Acceptance Month, because great, you're aware of it. Let's start accepting it, and let's start accepting that it's okay. Like, we quite often tell a story that, like, when India was first diagnosed, she was at school and they went around the class, it was something completely separate, had to say why they were different and what made them different, which was really cute. And India came home, she was about 9 at the time, and said, I told my class I was autistic. And we were like, oh my God, that's amazing. And she explained what it meant. And then everyone went around and shared something that was different about them. So India then was like, so it's normal to be different, because we're all different here. But I think it's about, in an ideal world, it's about making the workplace especially more neurodivergent friendly so that people can thrive, people can be themselves, and they need to do that with the understanding and the knowledge that it's normal to be different.
What is the difference between mental health and neurodivergence?
Neurodevelopmental is the way the brain works, the way you process information is a structural, if you want, thing. Mental health needs is a completely different ballgame. We tend to over-diagnose mental health difficulties.
And when you say mental health difficulties, you mean, and correct me if I'm wrong, anxiety, depression.
Yeah, anxiety, depression, mood disorders. That goes from bipolar disorder to dystemic personality disorders. The whole kind of mental health diagnosis handbook. It's completely different. You have lots of neurodivergent brains, that I like to call them brains, that don't have any mental health needs. And that's nothing wrong with that. The same way you have neurotypical with and without mental health difficulties.
But, correct me if I'm wrong, you have mental health aspects that can come from neurodivergence.
Yeah, absolutely. So, for example, later diagnoses are strongly associated with high rate of mental health difficulties, anxiety and depression. So it's very prevalent in women late diagnosed with ADHD being wrongly diagnosed with depression.
Okay.
And the reason being is because of the masking and social expectations. So these are women that have been called lazy. They feel they are not good enough. And then they go to seek medical advice, and you are depressed because you have low mood, you don't have energy, you are not eating properly, you are off work, and so forth. But actually, sometimes it's just an ADHD burnout, is ADHD non-diagnostic that is the cause of these responses.
Wow.
Yes. And they've been through years of medication that is not working.
For depression.
That is not working. And I have lots of women coming on 30, 40s, and they are neurodivergent. So, that feeling of something is wrong with me and I don't know what it is. Childhood years, yeah, when you start to pick up the society rules and how things work. So, why? But, you are doing well at school. You are not a troublemaker. You're not been causing any problems at home. And then go through life, social expectations, always with that kind of negative self-belief. I'm not good enough. Why is it so hard for me compared with everyone else? So that builds, obviously, the combination to develop depression, low self-esteem, sleep disturbance, poor appetite, and you are off work regularly because you are always tired. But it's not depression. You are just non-diagnosed with ADHD. Lazy, you are lazy. That's a very strong one, very common. Not good enough, you lazy. And that builds a very, very negative sense of self.
I'm trying to process what you're saying and translate it very simply so that I can understand it. Neurodivergence, you are born with. It's neurodevelopmental, right?
Yeah, in the way your brain. Yeah.
And it doesn't go away. There's no cure. You don't grow out of. I'm not going to get to 80 and be like, I'm not autistic anymore. No. I am autistic. I've been autistic since I was born, and I will be autistic till I die.
Yes.
Whereas mental health, I could go through periods of anxiety or depression. I'm not sure where bipolar sits or personality disorders.
Bipolar is under the mood disorders umbrella.
Okay.
And you can treat.
Can you see autism on a brain scan?
There are structural differences.
Differences. Okay.
And you can see beautiful brains. And that's why I think we are developing a better understanding as well with the assessments and with the clinical presentation. And we need to start to think about coding differently things. For example, I'm very interested in functional neurological disorders, and there's high prevalence between FND and autistic brains.
And what is a functional neurological disorder?
It's fascinating. It's amazing. So FND is, for example, someone that presents like a stroke, facial drop, weakness, slur speech. But actually, we don't have a structured change in the brain. So I do a CT scan or MRI, and I can't see damaging on the brain that will cause this. Okay.
That you would typically see?
Yeah, in a stroke. Yeah.
Yes.
But the behavioral presentation, it's absolutely the same. And there are very complex, like non-epileptic seizures patients, which so there are very complex presentation that from the outside is purely neurological presentation. But actually, what happens is just the brain is hyper-focusing on the attention span. Okay. So you get very, very, very focused on sensory response. And then the brain reads high levels of stress, your cortisol levels go really high, that triggers an immune response and flares up in a behavior state.
Okay.
Yeah. It's very similar with ASD reading model because it's that hypervigilant mode. Yeah. So I have that attention focus is really similar. And sensory overloaded. Okay, so they overlap a lot. There's a lot of eye rate of this presentation in autistic patients, and it's fascinating because working with neurodivergent brains is really cool because you don't waffle, you don't fluff around. You see, you just explain, and then it's very much cause effect. So the outcome is so great. The recovery rates, in my experience, is really amazing because you just need to explain the process. Look, this is what your brain is doing at the moment. Can you trick the brain? Can we put other strategies in place? And the recovery is happening. And usually, obviously, it's not as simple as I'm telling you. That you have the trauma, you have the stress, all the stress around. And that's what it is. It's a stress signal. But it's really cool. And the recovery rate is really, really awesome.
Yeah, I mean, it's great hearing that you think neurodivergent brains are really cool. Right?
I had a dad I know whose child has just been diagnosed, and the school are very keen that child goes on ADHD medication. And the father is really unsure. He doesn't know what to do because there's an element of, oh, of course you want my child to go on medication school. He'll sit still, he'll be behaved, the class will carry on, he'll focus, etc. But the moral and ethical piece of, and I'm being deliberately dramatic here, drugging your child doesn't sit so easy with him. And I know there are going to be loads of people out there who are facing that same challenge. And we know that the medication works for 8 hours. And I know plenty of parents that have children on medication in the week and not at the weekend. From a neuroscientific perspective, is there anything wrong with children who are ADHD being on medication?
There doesn't seem to be a conclusive body of literature one way or the other. It's looking towards more towards the safety profile. But then again, you have to question whether the studies have been funded by pharmacological companies and so on. And I don't want to get into conspiratorial theories, because at the end of the day, we need drugs, so we do need pharma companies. I resonate with this father. I would also have the same dilemma. And, and I feel it, I'm like 51 now, and I'm thinking, I don't want to be on drugs. So there's that stigma as well, associated with that kind of situation. But in terms of what you're doing to your brain, there are studies actually pro drugs on the basis that there is this thing called neuroplasticity, which is the way that your brain reorganizes itself. It learns, it adapts, it creates new connections between different parts of the brain. Within the same parts of the brain, it kind of expands the broadband, the bandwidth, part of the brain's capabilities, like a prefrontal cortex, for example. What we do know is that in children who are not medicated, they might struggle with the control of impulses, with the control of emotions, because various segments of the prefrontal cortex are actually not communicating constantly the way they should communicate with the more emotional controlled parts of the brain. So the communication is glitchy and a little bit broken down. And that, with the right amount of neuroplasticity, which is enabled by the drugs, can actually happen, and the child can have a behavior that is probably easier to manage by everybody around the child without feeling that you're actually dragging them.
Yeah.
But the same that I was saying before about, you do something and you think, oh, this is going to sort everything out. The drugs will sort everything out. I don't think that's the case. And it's not the case for the children who still need to learn to live life in a certain way.
Yep.
And it's not the case for adults as well. So if you just think taking the tablet in the morning is going to sort out your emotional mess, but you keep getting into toxic relationships at work or romantic or sexual or whatever, or you dab with alcohol or, whatever. If you don't look at, okay, what is going on in my life, and you just pretend that taking the tablet in the morning is going to sort everything out, you're gaslighting yourself.
Yes.
And the child doesn't have the ability to reflect on all of that, because children don't, they are not adults.
Yeah.
But they have responsible adults, ideally, who should not just look at the drugs as a way out. This is my child without drugs. I'm going to drug them, in inverted commas, and get rid of the naughty behavior.
Yes.
It's a chance for them to actually start creating a lifestyle that doesn't see the ADHD as a flaw. Is literally a neurotype, and that neurotype, in that particular situation, the child will thrive on the drugs, whereas off the drugs, it may struggle.
Why are, and correct me if I'm wrong on this stat, why are 40% of neurodivergent adults unemployed?
Ooh, that's a very good question. It'll be multifactorial, of course. I'm a psychologist. I'm going to say it depends, because that is always the answer. It depends. But the kind of factors that are affecting that, I mean, the biggest one's got to be school, hasn't it? I mean, goodness me, the number of people that come out of the education system fully believing that they have nothing to offer the world of work, when that is simply not true.
Yeah.
Because the school system is based on 5 skills, and 5 skills alone. Are you literate? Are you numerate? Can you do fine motor control handwriting? Can you sit still and concentrate for hours at a time? And can you do it in a busy, loud environment that's really sensory overwhelming? And if you can't do any one of those 5 things, there's a high chance that you're going to leave school without any qualifications, or at least with qualifications that don't reflect your potential. So that's the first reason, and I've worked in prisons. I've worked with people who are long-term unemployed since 2002. That was actually my first job as an occupational psychologist, was working with long-term unemployment. And, I used to see people and I think, my goodness, you've got no GCSEs. But I've just done a workshop with you for 3 or 4 hours. You are personable, insightful, funny.
Yeah.
How have you got no GCSEs? And then we bake these things into systems. So if you're really good at visual spatial reasoning, which you might be, you might have no GCSEs and
Sure.
be really, really good at visual spatial reasoning. You could be a bricklayer, an electrician, a hairdresser. But we've put basic English into the NVQs for all of those things. So you can't get those qualifications without also, I mean, I think they've slightly moved it now after years of me complaining about this and going to expert reference groups and moaning about it. I think they have finally listened. But, you know, for a long time, you couldn't even do the job that would play to your strength because we've put a literacy barrier in the way.
Yeah, forget it.
It's just, you know, what a waste of human potential.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah.
You know, so mindless. Even if you do have some good qualifications, or at least some relevant qualifications that you can make a living out of, often you come out of the school system with anxiety, with a sense of rejection. I mean, I didn't go to school for 2 years. I had 2 years out of the secondary school system, 14, 15, 16. I did my GCSEs by educating myself at home with work that my teachers sent me.
Okay.
Yeah. And that kind
Why
of...
didn't you go to school?
Lots of reasons. I mean, I was stopping going to school from about 12. I was so good at truanting when I was 12 that my secondary school didn't have an example of my mother's handwriting. Every time there was a genuine letter, I would write it out myself so that they didn't have a signature to compare it to. So, yeah, I couldn't sit still for that long.
Yeah.
I can't concentrate in overwhelming lighting for very long. I can do it for a little bit, but not for a whole day. I don't like the hustle and bustle. I didn't enjoy the kids.
Yep.
You know, I had friends outside school, but I didn't enjoy the kids in school. I found it kind of difficult, the way they would have all this in-group, out-group nonsense. Like, I can't play those games. Direct communicator. Yeah. I don't like those games. I don't want to play those games. They make me very unhappy and anxious.
Yeah.
So those are all the reasons I didn't go to school. But you know, you go into the world of work with that kind of situation and you're vulnerable. You're vulnerable to feeling rejected. You might overreact to the slightest rejection. And we call that rejection sensitivity. And it's a thing that happens. So if you're rejection sensitive, you might think that people are against you when they're not, and you might treat them like they're not. So you might end up having difficulties in building relationships because you're so used to people being hostile towards you or just weird and unusual and playing silly games like kids do at school. So you've got these kind of hang-ups and it makes it quite hard to engage in the workplace and to build relationships and to make friends. And honestly, a lot of the coaching clients that I've seen and that we see at Genius Within, that is what they're going through. They're trying to unpick, you know, am I genuinely being discriminated against here, or am I just being sensitive because I'm so used to being discriminated against? Like, what's going on? How do I sort that out? And, you know, it's 50-50. It can be either way. And people need help and guidance to get back into a place where they trust themselves.